Welcome to our discussion of third-party contracts as found in Chapter 9. A third-party contract is basically a contract where the parties get together and the whole purpose, the intent, the goal of that contract is to give somebody else something. The rules differ regarding whether the third party is somebody who is owed something, in other words, a creditor, or it just stands as a donee, in other words, is just getting a gift. Because the third party was intended to receive something, they have rights under the contract, even though they're not parties to that contract. A donee beneficiary contract is where the third party is just receiving a gift. It probably makes sense to you that the donee cannot then sue the donor because that underlying relationship is a gift, which is not a contract. The third party donee, the person who's receiving the gift, can go after the party who's supposed to send the gift to them because their rights to the contract have vested. Where you have a third-party creditor situation, where the third party happens to be owed something and the contract exists to give them money that's owed to them, that creditor has the right to go after either party, the one who's promised to give the consideration to the creditor and the party who originally owed the debt. We'll also learn about assignment and delegation, but let's start with a real-life situation. A friend of mine had an ex-spouse who owed her child support. She wanted me to garnish his bank account, which I did. When I garnished his bank account, I was able to seize a lot of money, and basically I had the rights to that money under the garnishment. Now, of course, the ex had other plans for that money. He intended to actually spend it on his bills and other things, so he was not happy about the garnishment. What he did was he said, look, I'm going to sell, he has a limousine service. I'm going to sell my limousine, one of them, to somebody else for $24,000, and then I'll pay off some bills. So when he contracted to sell his car, the car buyer was obligated to send $24,000 to somebody. Typically, it would go back to the seller. But in this case, he asked the buyer to send the money to somebody else, a third party, to me. So he asked me to receive the money and give him the excess back, which is very trusting of him. So basically, the buyer got the car, but instead of sending the money to the seller, he sent it to me. I represented the ex-wife who was a creditor of him, of the ex-husband. So that is the third-party creditor beneficiary contract. Under the rules of the chapter, if S, her name happens to be Susan, if Susan doesn't get the money from the guy who bought the limousine, she has the right to go after either her ex-husband or the guy who bought the limousine, because even though she's a third party to that contract, she's a stranger to that contract, she was an intended beneficiary, and her rights to step in the shoes of the the seller, her rights, she can go after the guy who owes her ex the money because it's owed to her now. Naturally, I refused to release the money that had been garnished from his bank account until I'd actually received the wire transfer for the $24,000 for the cost of selling the limousine. At that time, I released the garnishment and he was free to pay that money toward his bills. Garnishments can be hugely powerful tools. But they're a little bit like the lottery, because on any particular day that the garnishment goes through, you take a snapshot of what's in that person's account and you happen to get whatever's in there. If you happen to get it on a payday, you've hit pay dirt. If you happen to get it on a couple days before payday, you may not have much at all. I had insight into the situation because Susan told me when his payday was, and I was able to get the maximum amount of money garnished to pay the debt. So the net result was Susan got her money. It just took a little bit of machinations, a little bit of work to get it. So third-party beneficiary contract in particular, a third-party beneficiary contract, an agreement in which the original intent of one of the contracting parties when entering into the contractual agreement is to have the promise for consideration passed not to her, but to some outside person. In other words, it's giving rights to a third party who is not part of the contract, but whose rights become vested at some point and have the right, they then have the right to go after the parties on the original contract. Here are the two types that I previously mentioned. I took this from the book. So you can see the difference between the creditor and the donee beneficiary. Beneficiary's rights, that's the person, the third person. The third person's rights vest with detrimental reliance in the creditor situation. That usually means they look to that money to pay the debt. It's very easy to get detrimental reliance. It's not difficult at all. And that third party can then sue the promisor, which is the person who owes the money and was going to give it back originally to the first person, but now is giving it to the third person, or the promisee. The promisee is the original person who owes the money. I'm finding this hard to do without a chalkboard and a pen. Again, on the creditor beneficiary side of this chart, anyone can assert any defenses they have or any claims they have against anybody else. On the donee beneficiary side, we're talking about an underlying gift relationship, not a contract. So it takes very little for the beneficiary's rights to vest, but the beneficiary can only sue the promisor, the one who was expecting to give the money to somebody or the thing. And the promisor only can defend by asserting any claim he has against the promisee. For both types of these arrangements, the beneficiary has to be intended, not incidental. It needs to have been the main purpose to benefit the beneficiary, not just an aside. Here's an example of a creditor situation. X owes money to P. X loans money to D. D promising to pay that debt the next day. D fails to pay, and P then sues him. Held for P, plaintiff may recover from defendant as a third-party beneficiary of the contract between X and D. You see, the essence of this is just figuring out under what circumstances can a third party to a contract enforce some right under the contract or assert some defense that they have. I'll let you just read this one. Then we'll just talk briefly about assignment and delegation. So the major difference between assignment and delegation in a third-party relationship is the timing of when the contract was formed. If the contract was formed initially for the purpose of benefiting a third party, that would be a third-party relationship contract. If the contract existed first, and then after the contract started being executed, somebody wanted to shift over the rights under that contract to somebody else, it would be an assignment. You assign rights and you delegate duties is typically how it's broken down. Okay, let's quiz yourself on some of these principles. O'Hara owns Tara, a plantation. She hires Selznick to build a movie set in the backyard, which will enhance the value of the property next door, 12 Oaks, owned by Wilkes. When Wilkes learns of the pending set project, Wilkes adds a souvenir hut to his front yard. So Wilkes has spent some money based on his anticipation of this contract. Selznick breaches the contract with O'Hara and the set is never built. Can Wilkes sue Selznick as a third-party beneficiary to the O'Hara-Wilkes contract? Oh, I'm sorry, it should be O'Hara-Selznick contract. My apologies. O'Hara-Selznick contract. The answer is basically no. Wilkes is an incidental beneficiary under the contract between Selznick and O'Hara. Selznick and O'Hara were going to build a movie set, which was not intended to benefit Wilkes. He just would have, on the side, benefited in some nice way for him, but he wasn't intended to be part of the contract. So therefore, he is not someone who can sue in that situation. The next one. Betsy and Washington have a deal where Washington's going to pay off Betsy's debt to Singer. Singer knows about the agreement. That means he relies and his rights are vested. So Betsy doesn't hold up her end of the deal with Washington, so Washington refuses to pay Singer. Singer sues Washington for the $500. Does Washington have a valid defense? Yes, absolutely. Washington only has to give Singer money if Betsy performs on the contract and Washington's obligation to pay becomes due. Washington didn't get what he expected under the contract, and so therefore he doesn't have to pay. He wouldn't have to pay Betsy, so he doesn't have to pay Singer. So he has a defense. In this situation of assignment, the buyer and seller have a deal, and X, a third party, wants to get in on that deal. So he essentially asks for the rights of B under the contract, which is an assignment. Now seller owes X rights under the contract, and that has the effect of extinguishing B's rights. So if the seller fails to deliver the widgets, X now, who stepped into B's shoes, can sue. B cannot, because he's been deleted from the contract. In this example, Noah and Sammy have an existing contract. The consideration was $2,000. The payment, now Webster wants to go to his nephew Spider. It's a gratuitous situation where Spider just gets the benefit. Number one, Webster can revoke unless the situation becomes irrevocable through one of the 5 things listed on page 218: delivery of a token chose, a writing, estoppel, performance, or novation. So Webster can change his mind because it's a gift situation unless one of those 5 things has happened. Under traditional common law of contracts, Sammy Goldfish must pay the $2,000 to Spider unless doing so materially altered Sammy's obligation under the contract. Let's say Spider is in Peru and we've got to contact him and pay him in a different money form. Under that situation, Sammy could argue that is too much extra for him to do and refuse to assign those payments to Spider. But for the most part, contracts are assignable. Sorry, I've got a wicked cold. Under delegation, somebody in the contracts promises that somebody else will do the duty. Think about a sublease for an apartment. In that situation, the party who has the lease tries to get somebody else to fill his spot on the lease because maybe he's buying a house or he wants to get out of the contract. In that situation, he needs the landlord's permission to assign the right of living in the apartment and the duty of paying the rent to the subtenant. Typically, these contracts have non-assignment clauses in them that prevent subcontracting to a subtenant. And in any event, even if it were permitted by the landlord to bring somebody else in under the lease, the delegator, the original tenant, remains liable for the duty of paying rent. So typically the landlord would expect a stream of rent from either the original tenant or the tenant who's in there now. Some things cannot be delegated. Contracts involving particular skills, artistic performances, professional services, Classic example of that is that Sly Stallone can't delegate his right to be in the Rocky movie to Pee Wee Herman. It's a personal obligation, and it would materially change the situation. You can see in this example, too, that same principle applies. A novation. This is where both parties agree that the new person should take the place of one of them. Once novation occurs, the left out party is no longer liable. This is what that guy with the apartment really wants to have happen. He really wants the new tenant to come in and completely take his place and get him off the lease entirely. But a landlord would be stupid to do that when the law says that as a delegator, he remains liable under the contract. That's it for this one. Man, I can barely even talk. Okay, talk to you later.